Let's talk about it. So
but education, science, big tech, the HR departments of major corporations in this country, like it's touching everything. And
I got a notification from my university department today. They developed a contract for undergraduates who are going to work in labs, which seems to me to be completely unnecessary anyways, because that was something that was always handled by individual professors. But most of it's just, care of data and the sorts of things that you might expect that might be made explicit if you were going to work in a lab. But of course, 2/3 of the way in it, there's a huge statement about all the groups that you're not allowed to be prejudiced against in your conduct and so forth. And so it's just another example of how these ideas, these, let's call them anti-racist ideas for the time being, or anti-group prejudice ideas, are there's an insistence that they manifest themselves everywhere. And you might say, well, who isn't anti-racist? And so why object to that? And my sense is that, well, they don't stand on their own. They're part of an entire system of ideas. That's the thing that's always bothered me, is that there's a whole system of ideas here. And I mean, maybe it's best exemplified in critical race theory. That's sort of its most extreme.
Yeah, I also really don't believe in seeding the language, like in saying, call it anti-racism, because I'm not seeding that language to an ideology that is insisting on resegregating the culture.
Why not seed the language?
Because it's a war of language. It's a war of language. I mean, if you're going to call what's essentially neo-racism and neo-segregation anti-racism, like, I'm not going to go along with the lie of that. I'm just not. I am going to insist on a version of anti-racism that is rooted in our common humanity and is actually about eradicating racism, not on obsessing on the social construct of race and reifying it and making us pitted in a kind of like zero-sum war against each other based on our immutable characteristics. I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. I'm not giving in to their language.
Yeah, well, then the question is, right, where do you draw the line? I mean, I didn't want to use identity politics language in reference to personal pronouns in Canada, and that's pretty much done in my career as a researcher and probably as a clinical psychologist as well. So it's not a trivial battle to undertake. And people, of course, asked, well, why did you pick that particular hill to die on? Because what weren't protections that were already built into the law for other groups merely extended to another deserving group? But what I saw was a terrible misuse of language at a very fundamental level. So part of it was an issue of compelled speech. I have to use the terminology that you demand, and you claim that it's only about your emotional well-being and your identity. But for me, it's part and parcel of a complete ideology. And then there's also the smuggling in of a particular view of identity that I don't believe has any credence whatsoever, because your identity is by no means only who you feel that you are. Your identity is a complex game that you negotiate with others. And what it is exactly is very difficult to elucidate, because it's central to the nature of human existence, what your identity is. But it's certainly not the simplistic group signifier that can be that you conveniently hang your hat on, especially when you want to exercise arbitrary power over other people without them noticing that that's what you're doing. So I don't want to cede the language either. And part of the discussion we can have today is just about exactly what the language implies. We could talk about systemic racism for a minute or two, if you don't mind. Then we'll get back to the Wall Street Journal story and sort of move biographically. Yeah. Well, so I've been thinking about the phrase systemic racism. And it's a very interesting phrase, because it's sort of systemic racism. And you can't hear racism. Well, it's important. You can't hear racism. Like, as soon as you hear racism, there's a moral issue, a major moral issue at stake. And the proposition essentially is, if I come up to you and say, this is racist, I instantly put you in a position where if you disagree with anything that I'm saying, you have to defend yourself morally right to the basis of your soul, because it's such a terrible thing. Arbitrary prejudice is such a terrible, devastating thing. And virtually everyone recognizes that. And so there's a club that comes along with the use of the phrase right away. And the club is, well, I'm on the right side of history here with my claim about opposing this terrible satanic an ethnocentric viewpoint. And then I can say systemic. And so I've been thinking about systemic. Now, systemic means pervasive. It means everywhere. That's what systemic means. It has its connotations and its explicit meaning. But it means that it's the central tendency of the system, let's say. And that's just wrong. The central tendency of functional Western social institutions is not racism. The central tendency is something like cooperative endeavor towards productive ends. And the aberration is deception and power and racism. But the central tendency isn't that. Now, and this is the crucial issue here, because systemic means central tendency. And if you accept systemic, not only do you accept that the central tendency is racist, let's say, and exclusionary, and that also means in support of the privilege of certain groups, because that's part and parcel of the entire argument, but you also accept the proposition that the motivations that drive people to success in the systemically racist system also have to be power and systemic racism, hence the use of tests like the implicit association test. So not only are the institutions systemically racist, but the psychological motivations of those who are striving to move forward within the systems are all of a sudden now tyrannical power and systemic racism. And all that's packed into that word systemic. And it's just snuck in there because racism is so loud and so vicious and so horrible that you're not allowed to object to anything that manifests itself within its vicinity. It's unbelievably, what would you call it? It's propagandistic is probably the right word. But it blows people out of the water because they're hit with this racist issue. And that just, it rattles them up so badly ethically that they can't stand forward and make a reasonable argument.
Well, there's a ton there, Jordan. I guess I would say that I think there is a way to acknowledge that, for example, this country had, in the way that, let's say, Black Americans were deprived of building generational wealth because they were deprived of loans. They weren't allowed to buy homes, or, redlining, or Jim Crow, or we could go all the way back to 1619 or slavery. I mean,
we could go back a lot farther than that.
But meaning it is true that there were systems in America that were, I don't know what other word to say it, systemically racist.
Well, you could say there were systems in America that were racist without saying there were systems in America that were systemically racist. There's no doubt whatsoever that arbitrary prejudice is a blight upon mankind and that it manifests itself everywhere.
But it's not just arbitrary, right? If you look just at one discrete example, like the drug war, the disparity between the punishment in the 1980s between being caught with crack and being caught with cocaine. I don't know what else to call that. But
you call it racist.
Sure, but that's not just whatever the adjective you used before was. Just before.
Well, we should argue about this a lot because it's the core point. So it's a good idea to do this. So there are definitely systematic manifestations of racism. They inculcate themselves, let's say, into the legal system. And some of them are more explicit and some of them are more implicit. But that's not the issue. The issue, or that's not the issue when you're talking about systemic racism, because there's a tangle of claims in that term. And so please do argue with me. Okay,
so I think that we need to be able to acknowledge, I think as you just did, what I just said, and also see that the way that phrase is being weaponized right now is basically as an argument to tear down liberalism, America, and the West.
Okay. So now we're starting to unpack that. So So we'll look at the issue of racism first. Okay, so people are radically ethnocentric, and that's a human universal. Now, we have a tendency to trade with groups of people who aren't us, and we will investigate them and explore them, but we're also not so much terrified of them because it's not exactly fear, but leery of them. And we're leery of them for all sorts of reasons. One reason we're leery of them, I just talked to a great biologist whose name is going to escape me momentarily. He formulated the parasite stress theory of political belief. And so one of the things he points out is that as isolated groups of human beings came into contact with one another throughout our entire evolutionary history, we were able to trade ideas and goods, and that was greatly to our benefit. But we also traded infectious agents, and that killed us a lot. And so we have this terrible tension at the base of our being between being open to what's new and being killed by what's new. And so that's part of what makes us ethnocentric. It's not by any means the entire thing. But we have this ethnocentrism built in, as well as the desire to trade. Slavery is a human universal. It goes back as far back in time as you can possibly manage. And so we can admit that all those things exist, and we can admit that they're powerful tendencies without having to take this next step, which is the one that you pointed to, by saying, well, that's the foundation of our institutions themselves.
Right.
And because of that, the institutions have to be torn down.
Rather than saying slavery has been with humanity for eons, and the exceptional thing about America is not that we had slavery, but that slavery was abolished.
Okay, and I would say that's the exceptional thing about Britain, not America, because the Brits did it first. And that's my understanding of the situation. Now, that doesn't take away from the American accomplishment or the Canadian accomplishment for that matter. Right. The systemic tendency is the eradication of slavery.
I'm simply saying that the thing that is being emphasized that I want to push back against, that often comes along with the use of the phrase systemic racism, is the idea that because the dead white men that created, that wrote the Constitution, or that came up with these Enlightenment values, or any number of other things that have allowed us to live in this exceptional, let's say, civilization, it's beyond just America, that because of their moral hypocrisy, that somehow the things that they built are ill-gotten and need to be sort of rooted out, torn down at the core. And I fundamentally reject that view.
Okay, now why should I presume that your fear of, okay, you've just characterized the relationship between the idea of systemic racism with a bunch of other ideas. Okay, so, right, the idea that there's a lot more to the story than the mere emphasis on systemic racism. There's a belief that the institutions themselves, the fundamental institutions of the West, are corrupt right to their core.
That is the implication often of the people using the phrase, but I think one should be able to use the phrase without implying all of that. Unfortunately, right now, when you hear it, it tends to be that the things I just described come along with the use of that phrase. A little bit like anti-racism.
Why are you convinced that your belief that the idea of systemic racism is associated with these other ideas is true?
Because I see it.
Tell me about that.
I mean, I don't know where to start. I mean, that is...
I understand that.
So help push me toward what area you're
Well,
most interested
I
in.
agree with you. I mean, the reason that I took the stance I took 5 years ago, which I've had plenty of time to think about, by the way, is because I saw the linkage between ideas. I didn't believe that this was just what it appeared to be. It was associated with an entire ideology. And the ideology seems to me to be, I'll lay out some of its features, and you can tell me if you think it is in accord with what you see.
That inequality of outcome is evidence of systemic discrimination, for example.
Yes, that would be inequality of outcome conveniently described for the purposes of justifying the ideology.
Yeah, let me describe how I like some of the features of this ideology, and you tell me if you agree. That inequality of outcome is necessarily a result of systemic discrimination or systemic bigotry.
Okay, and that's part of the equity issue.
Sure. But again, that's another one of these words that's been hijacked.
I know. Well, that's exactly why I brought it up, is because I've been talking to a group of people in LA who are liberals and on left of me, I would say. And we've been stuck on this issue of equity because I've been insisting, for example, that it does mean it's a drive towards equality of outcome defined in exactly the manner that you describe. And their insistence is, no, that's a view that only a minority of the people who are pushing the idea of equity hold.
Well, and the majority of people that go along with, equity just think, I believe in fairness. They're not thinking deeply about this. It's like the person that says Black Lives Matter. Well, of course, Black Lives Matter. But if you look under the hood of what the organizations that are at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement believe, well, they believe in, abolishing the nuclear family. They believe in abolishing or defunding the police. They believe that capitalism is evil. I mean, they believe in all kinds of things, but the majority of people that are saying or putting up a sign, Black Lives Matter, are saying racism's bad. The majority of people that are saying, I believe in equity and diversity, are saying, I believe in the dignity of difference, and I believe in fairness, and I believe in equality of opportunity. So when the people in these theoretical people in LA, when they're saying that, is that what they mean, or do they mean something else?
No, I think what they mean is that the people who are pushing equity believe in equality of opportunity, and they don't see the
Trojan horseness.
They're exactly right, and these are reasonable people, and they're not that happy with political correctness. I should also say, so they're as reasonable a group as I can communicate.
But I have to be honest, at this point, if one can't see the way that this language has been hijacked and has been used as a kind of Trojan horse, brilliant, I should say, Trojan horse strategy to smuggle in a sort of hardened identity, zero-sum identity politics view of the world, to smuggle in a view of the world in which we either have collective guilt or collective innocence, literally based on the circumstances of our birth, that smuggle in a, deeply anti-capitalist position, that smuggle in essentially, a leftist illiberalism, then I'm sorry, you have blinders on. The evidence for this is so overwhelming at this point. I'm really not sure how, like, if you don't want to believe it, I think it's because the discomfort of believing it outweighs let me say that again. Yeah. I think it's because that admitting that that's true and that that's what's happening is extremely psychologically scary. And it's extremely socially scary if you are a liberal. Because all of a sudden it means that these institutions and let's just even say like the social world and the culture that you took for granted as being a certain thing and having certain qualities is no longer what it appears to be. And that is the perfect segue to connect it back to the New York Times.
Yeah.